Let's gradually start. Welcome everyone to this panel, which is almost a small conference within the heart of the European University of St. Petersburg. And as you know, this section is dedicated to the question of energy, power, force, whatever you call it, as a notion, as a concept. So many of scholars in this university and others study energy today as an empirical fact and question. But this panel is a panel of theorists, of philosophers, who want to look at our a priori conditions of understanding and possibility of energy and power, which is to say to understand what's going on in the larger context of human history and human nature. So we invited some very interesting and interesting scholars who specialize in this area from around the world. So today, apart from me, there is Darren Barney from McGill, who writes extensively on the question of resource extraction from the point of view of political theory. Then Oksana Timofeyeva on my left, a familiar person for the European University public, who works on the animals. Michael Lewis from the University of Sussex, who works on general philosophy, who wrote a book on Lacan and Derrida, among others, and now we'll also address the question of fossil, the notion of the fossil, in particular the speculative realism, where, as you know, it is becoming popular. And Georgios Tsagdis, on my right, from the University of Westminster, also works on the philosophy of nature. Somehow Britain is overrepresented, I think, this conference. I don't include Canada into Britain, but overall, it's well, Britain has some resources. After all. But not as much as Canada and Russia. And there is Michael Marder from the University of Basque Country, a very well-known and important specialist on the philosophy of nature, philosophy of plants in particular, and philosophy of elements. In his recent work. Unfortunately, Michael has some business to attend, so he could not come in person, and will be with us on Skype. But here he is. The presence of Michael is even larger than the presence of the living beings at this table. So it's maybe even a plus that he's so far from us. Okay, so I will give a talk. I am not a specialist in this area. The only one who is not a specialist. I'm just interested as a citizen and as a scholar. But I will do what I can to speak very generally about this the problem or the problematic of energy. And I hope through my talk somehow to introduce the discussion, to introduce the subject matter. And you may, of course, disagree and say that the subject matter is totally different, so that's fine. So I'm now gradually moving to my talk, although it's still an introduction. Energy is one of the key notions, problems, and objects of discussion in today's world. All the everyday life, all industry, all economy depend on the sources of energy. Most of them of exhaustible energy, the energy that will end. One worry, mostly discussed now in the West, is that the energy is going to end at some point. Like here in Russia, we don't care that much. Actually, in Russia, the worry is rather the opposite, that we have too much energy, too many sources of energy. And that's why our economy is going back. So if you are on the left, then you probably regret that the extraction of oil makes your country a reservoir for exploitation. If you are liberal, you regret that it leads to authoritarian politics. And if you are, if you are conservative, you probably regret the destruction of your home country's nature and the extermination of peasantry, etc., etc. So, although the country thrives on these energy resources, the intellectuals tend not to like this fact. The Russian critics of culture, writers, poets, add that there is also a symbolic meaning of oil extraction from under the earth. You know, there is some kind of symbolic alliance with some dark, hellish forces of underground that somehow emerge with this oil extraction. Victor Pelevin, if you read this author, or many others speculate on this demonic side, dark side of the force. Ilya Kalinin, our colleague, he even calls this genre of literature petropoetics, poetics about oil. But actually, this meaning is old. At least in the modernity, energy was often associated with the demonic, satanic side. For example, by William Blake, he uses the notion of energy precisely in this sense. Marriage between heaven and hell, has this piece where the hell represents energy. Of course, if we are more serious, then we have to turn to the theory of energy in science and philosophy. It has often been noted that the elaboration of the physical theory of energy, with its laws of conservation of energy, advanced in the early 19th century by many authors like Young, Joel, Meyer, Helmholtz, Meyer actually, he was German. And with the law of its inevitable dispersion into entropy that was advanced by Clausius somewhat later in the mid-19th century, had immediate anthropological repercussions, whether metaphoric or logically extrapolating from it the slow exhaustion of human will to act, the apathy, the melancholia, the degenerescence, and respectively the need to have more energy, the need to be energetic. So the idea of energy, when it was invented, was immediately translated into some kind of metaphysical pessimism, which changed in the 20th century with the discovery of electricity and electric technologies. There was somehow a new wave of cultural optimism about the technology, particularly in this country, where as you know, Lenin associated communism with the electrification of the country, and there was again there were a lot of writers, poets who wrote on this, like the most important one, Andrei Platonov, who has mystical theories about electricity, somehow giving people their life force. So these changes but in both cases, I mean in all these cases, there is on the one hand an empirical state of affairs, such as the finitude and the shortage of material resources, and a broader conception of nature and humanity, which are somehow implied in this word energy. But it is very important that the word itself, the notion itself, is by no means innocent. Actually, as it is obvious to most philosophers, but not at all obvious to general public, the contemporary notion of energy as a quantity of force, the way it is used in the everyday language, like you have energy, you don't have energy to do something, or you extract energy from material resources to use it in the industry or to use it in the arms production or whatever, this is actually an inversion of the original sense of this word. Actually, such inversions of classical philosophical concepts are very common for modernity. Take democracy, for instance, which I have just written in the book. It's another case of such inversion. So, energy in the 20th century means precisely the opposite of what it meant in the 5th century BC when the word was invented. Because for Aristotle, who invented it, actually it's an artificial word, it doesn't really exist in the Greek language, or at least as a commonly used one. Energy is the inner activity or action, says Aristotle, of a thing, which is precisely opposed to what he calls power or force, in Greek dunamis, and which is precisely only potential. So you have the potential, which is dunamis, and you have the energeia, energy, which is its realization. So energy in Aristotle is a teleological notion that opposes the notion of power. Energy gives form, gives accomplishment to the power that is implicit in nature or matter. Moreover, energy is characteristic for emotion, for an action that exists for itself, because it's teleological. So the power is exercised and accomplished in the energy. So when you have energy, you don't need anything else. Basically, this activity is a goal in itself, says Aristotle. As opposed to the force or power, dunamis, which exists only on the condition of being mobilized by something else and for something else. Greeks, of course, had their technology, and they knew what an instrumental relation is and how it can be used, but precisely energy was on the side of the purpose, of the effect of technology, not on the side of what is needed for the technology to function. How did it happen, and why did it happen, this inversion? It's not an easy question. In fact, it's not even clear if this is a pure inversion or if something is still preserved from the original word, from the original meaning of the word. A recent Russian philosopher, Vladimir Bibikhin, rightly notes that in spite of this apparent inversion, there is actually some continuity in the meaning. Because modernity, culturally speaking and politically speaking, makes out of force its value, its main value. So it's important to show that you are strong. It's important to feel strong, physically strong, strong as a country, you need to show your strength continuously. If you look into the recent Russian policy, you know that this is precisely, even explicitly stated by our politicians. So it's not that important what you do, but it is important that by what you do, you demonstrate how strong you are. Like shelling Syria with missiles from Caspian Sea or something like that. And this is not me, but Bibikhin speaking, although he didn't know about Caspian Sea, but apart from this, he knew that our culture is centered on the energy as a purpose in itself, like in Aristotle's times, but with another meaning. So not energy as the accomplishment of something, as a, for example, creation of a full-blown personality, perfection in some skill or art, but strength and power becomes a goal in itself. And in this sense, energy is a good word to use, says Bibikhin. Even though there is an inversion in other respects. Now, so for now I just said this to show you that there is a problem. That not only the problem is how these layers of meaning combine in the notion, but also the relationship of new energy to its original meaning is problematic. And as you all understand, original meaning is important because that's what the sense of the word is. That's why it means what it means. The origin of the word says a lot about its meaning, even though of course not everything. Now back to history. The actual idea that there is something in motion apart from its velocity, from acceleration, from the force that is applied to start this motion belonged to Leibniz in the late 17th and early 18th century. Although Leibniz mostly used the word, the combination of two words, vis viva, live force, which he opposed to the dead force of mere inertia. So the idea was that the body moves, and this motion is directed, is caused not simply by a push that was given to it. If I push this mouse, I don't touch it, but it continues moving. But that when I pushed it, I applied a force that then is transferred into the mouse itself. So to the notion of an instantaneous force, Leibniz opposes the notion of a continuous force, of a force that acts continuously and therefore somehow becomes inherent, at least for a time, to the thing that moves. Things that surround us are not simply external, extended objects that don't have any internal substance, internal power, but through their interaction, there is some power that becomes internal to them. So things actually matter. Things have something substantial in them. And that's why the motion is explained not only by the instantaneous forces, what they called momentum, but also by the continuously acting forces that Leibniz called vis viva. And he also uses the word entelechia, so Aristotelian word, which in Aristotle is not synonymous but is close to the notion of energy. And energy is something that aims toward entelechy, says Aristotle. Therefore, Leibniz can be said and is usually considered the true author of our notion of energy, even though he didn't coin the word. as such. The guy who coined the word lived later, and he was called Thomas Young, again a British, and this was a completely different period. They already discussed complicated machines, steam machines, etc. And for this technology, of course, it turned out that Leibniz's definition is better. When it turned out that Leibniz won in this debate, because there was a debate, Newton and Newtonians rejected this notion of vis viva, and they were debating for 100 years, and then the British agreed, although, as you understand, the British were all Newtonians, and they could not accept it for a while. So when they accepted it, they had to change the word. They could not use the vis viva. So for political reasons, they had to find something else, and they chose the Aristotelian word of energy. Thus somehow depriving Leibniz from his authorship once again. But this is, intrigues. Actually, in the 19th century, Young uses Leibniz's meaning for what they later called kinetic energy, so the energy that the object has in moving. But it turned out that this kinetic energy is not really preserved, particularly in these complicated machines that also involve heat, warming and cooling. Therefore, William Rankine in the 50s of 19th century introduced a division between kinetic energy and potential energy. And then if you combine, as you know from the school course of physics, if you combine kinetic and potential energy, if you also calculate the energy of heat, then you have the law of conservation of energy, which is absolute. And this is where the full inversion happens, because to say potential energy would, for Aristotle, be seemingly impossible. Because precisely the potential and the energy are opposite. Vis viva and Young's energy were still more or less okay within the Aristotelian framework. So it is Rankine with the potential energy who really inverted the meaning and who really provided the conditions for our usage of energy as a synonym of force. This said, I think that things are not that simple even with Aristotle, because in Aristotle, apart from these two notions of force and energy, there is a notion of motion itself, kinesis. Of course, force, dynamis and energeia, they characterize motion. But what is motion? Motion, says Aristotle in the Physics, is the actuality of the possible qua possible. Hetu dynami ontos entelechia, eto euton kinesis estin. So it's the entelechy of the dynamis itself. Motion is the entelechy of the dynamis itself. And so Aristotle already synthesizes the two notions, because entelechy, as I said, is almost the same here as energy. It's the motion is the actuality of the inaccomplished, says Aristotle. It's a possibility. It's a little bit realized, but not quite. So in this sense, Leibniz and the moderns after him do develop an Aristotelian intuition that there is something in common, or something synthetic between energy and potentiality, even though they confuse some terms, etc. So the new energy, as Aristotelian motion, is something that acts, but not quite, which moves, but is also stalled in action. And anthropologically speaking, I would compare this understanding of energy with Walter Benjamin's idea of action. As you know, in his late text on the concept of history, he says that our activity is somehow mobilized and motivated by all the failures, all the previous breakdowns of efforts to liberate the world, to accomplish one's wishes, etc. Benjamin here thinks in very teleological terms, in a sense, in very Aristotelian terms, but he introduces this notion of failure. With regard to your goal, you fail, you're frustrated. And this is where the energy emerges, according to Benjamin, in a sense. This is where the energy emerges that later gives us force. I think both Aristotle, in his notion of motion, and the tradition between Leibniz, Young, and others, anthropologically, this is the meaning. That its energy is force interrupted, or action interrupted. Now, I know I take a little bit more time, but sorry, because it's a work in progress, energy. So I will spend a little bit of energy, a little bit more energy, and then I will finish. One last historical point is that, of course, Aristotle's teleology, which again seems to contradict the modern concern for efficient causes and the general approach to the world in the linear logic of chain of efficient causality. You know that it was a conscious rupture with the Aristotelian tradition. Nevertheless, the notion of energy introduces an obvious reference to telos. Why? Because of the technology. Already in Leibniz, and even more so in Young and Rankin and others, when they use energy, they explain that we cannot judge the force simply by the original impulse of moving. We need to look at at what they call work, at the actual effect that a technological usually the example is technology, so that a technological machine, a mechanism, produces. So energy is the work retrospectively projected into the material with which we produce technology, with which our technology works. In this sense, technology is our new teleology. The usage of the word energy somehow reproduces the Aristotelian picture of the world, the ancient picture of the world, but with the difference that what for them was seen as the inner development of one's forces, for us is a machine that also develops forces and produces an effect, but this effect is supposed to be used for some other goal, and that's the problem. So there are two teloi, not one for us. Now, what is the conclusion in terms of the conclusion from all this, if we return to politics, to society and politics? Well, first of all, the activity and substantiality of natural things is reaffirmed in the concept of energy, but only to frame our relationship to this activity as exploitation. We need to remember that Aristotle was a slaveholder, and he defines a slave as a living tool, as an animated tool. And in a sense, Leibniz and others, they do similar thing. They return to the animistic anthropomorphic language only to reinforce the instrumental attitude to these living things. So it's like in the Russian literature, you know, this novel of Gogol, Dead Souls, Mертвые души. Gogol also plays on this, that we speak of these enslaved peasants very highly. We say dushi when we count them, but we only say this because we want to somehow to steal their energy. And Gogol, of course, plays and says that they are actually dead souls. So compare Leibniz on this life force, dead force. And of course, you know that Marx wrote a lot on this living labor, dead labor. This distinction is, of course, a constant concern for modern theory of nature and theory of society. Energy, qua vis viva, is again a continuously acting force. As such, if we translate this into the political language, what do we get? We get the notion of constituent power, which has been discussed a lot in the last 40 years in political theory. Because constituent power is a power of revolutionary foundation which continues to act in a state, in a polity, long after this polity had been established. So France lives right now, it has a president, it has a government, but it has still its legitimacy depending on some constituent moments, such as 1968, such as the liberation from the Nazis, and such as de Gaulle's reform, back to the French Revolution of 1789, there are moments of constituent power and constituent force in the French Republic. And it's important because this means that you not only have the legal powers in this country and in any country, but also some kind of less legalized, informal power of the people that runs from the earlier times. And this, as you know, Negri wrote about it a lot, and others did. But usually the point of reference in the history of philosophy is Spinoza. Negri quotes Spinoza's notion of natura naturans as a creative force of nature as opposed to the laws of nature. But in fact, it would be more accurate to use Leibniz, not Spinoza, for several reasons. First of all, it is Leibniz who really emphasizes that the force is not simply a creative, anarchic power, but is a continuously acting force, a force that is somehow integrated through time. And this would explain this, temporal delay in the constitutional legitimacy by the constituent power, which Spinoza doesn't write about, to my knowledge. Also, Spinoza is famous for being an advocate of efficient causality, even though Spinoza himself doesn't understand himself to some extent. But he was instrumental historically for introducing only this type of causality. And Negri, with his interpretation of Spinoza as the theorist of multitudes of constituent power, of revolution, remains prisoner of this Spinoza's reduction of causality, of his materialism. Because, it's a long story, but to cut the thing short, Spinoza's materialism drives him to an essentially conservative reformation of status quo. While in Leibniz, there is a teleology. There is a force that acts as an efficient cause. But it also has a teleological cause, the final cause, because it works towards perfection with Leibniz. Leibniz, as you know, had a teleology, the idea of the best of all possible worlds, etc. So, if you translate this to politics, then you don't only have the class, the multitude, whose force you want to put into politics, and you want to make a revolution with this force, but you also have the question why you want to do this, and what kind of politics you actually want to conduct after you gain power, which is absolutely unclear in Negri, who remains anarchist, and this, of course, deprives of legitimacy the whole affair, not only his theory, but also the movement of which he is one of the main ideologists. The rejection of teleology is wrong, politically as physically, and the energy is the notion that reminds us of this, that has this hidden latent potential of teleology that we don't pay enough attention to. Nevertheless, both Negri, Spinoza, and Leibniz, they rightly see that material forces are part of the political legitimacy. It would be, for example, inaccurate to understand the political power of the current Russian state with all its legitimacy only from the point of view of democracy, that people support Putin and therefore Putin is legitimate, or that in the 1993 there was a new Russian constitution, Putin is legal and under this constitution, therefore he is legitimate. It is impossible to understand the legitimacy of this state without a consideration of natural power, of the energy on many levels, including the material level. Maybe it can sound a little wild, but we need somehow to conceive this, that there is, of course, the energy of the people, of which there is not much in Russia. The people are pretty apathetic. Productivity of labor is very low, and even during the Soviet time it was a source of much concern. But there is a lot of solar energy that is accumulated in the fossils, in the organic waste from millions of years. So I would say that the legitimacy of the Russian state is a combination of the current constitution, of the revolution of 1991, of the accumulated solar energy of oil and gas, and of the teleological power of communism that was acting for a while and then was stalled and interrupted. Again, a classical case of energy. Energy is something that acts and then is stalled. And then there is a remainder. And actually oil is also not fully destroyed in the process of extraction. So there is a potential of rethinking the whole apparatus of political legitimacy through the notion of constituent power, through rethinking our division, interdisciplinary division between social sciences and physics, natural sciences, humanities. Unfortunately, in this university we only have social sciences, and even they are divided into 5 departments for the reason I don't understand. There is a need of a more complex vision of the state and of the history of Russia, of the world, because the concepts are the same and the processes are more or less the same. They have been divided artificially for the purposes that were not good. That's what I wanted to say. I'm sorry I took so much time, but we still have some. So.